So I think that's I think it's a positive step on a couple of different ways, and also there's an important linkage from the federal sustainable development strategy to the process in Canada for strategic EA of policies, plans, and programs. We have a cabinet directive, so we don't have legislated responsibility to do SEA, but we do have a cabinet directive that they must be done for whenever a department wants to bring forward a proposed policy, plan, or program, a strategic EA has to be done. And now, with the release of the federal SDS, we've made enhancements to how the SEA process will be implemented in Canada. There will be an explicit linkage now in those SDSs, those SEAs that are done to the goals and targets set out in the federal strategy. So there will be increased transparency and reporting on how departments are considering those kinds of targets as they bring forward policy program proposals. And so transparency and reporting, will contribute to the fact that, as we all know, governments care about what they report on, and what gets measured gets managed. So we think that there are some real positive steps that we've taken to addressing. There have been some criticisms of how well the strategic EA process has been implemented in the Government of Canada. The word fundamentally broken was tossed around by one evaluation. So we certainly think that some of the steps that we've just taken will help to address that and make some improvements. But now let's move on to really what most of us think about, which is Project EA. We have our piece of legislation, of course, is the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, which is targeted at Project EA. For those who aren't intimately familiar with how our legislation works, in 3 bullets or less, we do have a definition of an environmental effect that does include both changes that the project may cause in the environment and changes to the project caused by the environment. Perfectly situated, of course, for consideration of climate, GHG reductions, and impacts and adaptation measures. We don't have basically a project needs to trigger a federal EA. We have a set of measures that determine whether or not any given project requires a federal EA based on a range of triggers that I won't go into, but it's a trigger-based approach. You do need, and of course, and I point this out only because I think it's going to lead to something I'm going to talk about after, that when we do have approvals on projects, they will require implementation of mitigation measures that will eliminate, reduce, or control the adverse environmental effects. And I think that's an important point that I'm going to come back to. Climate change factors aren't explicitly identified, but implicitly they certainly by environmental effects will include climate change. And important to make sure that you understand as well in Canada, under the constitutional context, in terms of we have 10 different provincial EA regimes that all also have an important role in the big picture, and the interaction between what we do at the federal level with our provincial EA processes is an area that causes a great amount of concern in Canada. Both the federal and provincial governments are all formally committed to working towards one project, one assessment, and one of our ongoing responsibilities is trying to figure out a way to do that and to have effective, harmonized processes. I'm okay, right? So in 2003, we released a set of guidance for practitioners incorporating climate change considerations in EA. They're available on our website. You can find them pretty easily. It was a cooperative approach. A federal, provincial, territorial committee all contributed to it. My colleague back when I worked at Environment Canada actually was one of the people from EC contributing to that exercise. I think based on some of the things that we've heard here today, we're pretty far out in front of a lot of other governments in terms of setting out formal guidelines. And I think Dr. Agrawal in his paper, sort of recognized that and gave us some kudos for it. And what do they say? Well, the guidance basically offers some methods to obtain and evaluate information about a project's GHG emissions and the impacts of climate change on the project. It talks about some information sources, and it offers some pretty perhaps basic guidance on methodology, but guidance nonetheless. in 2 slides. Basically, the guidelines set out, there's a section that sets out a process, and there's a pretty chart in the guidelines that you can see that says a very matter-of-fact, common-sense way one would try and assess for a project what the GHG emissions were. Do a scoping around the issues, make sure you understand the regulations, identify jurisdictional considerations, assess what the actual emissions are, come up with management plans, and then have monitoring, follow-up, and management actions afterwards. Likewise, on impacts and adaptation, do preliminary scoping, identify what the key impacts would be, and assess them, and come up with management plans. So, do they go far enough? No, but they're a step, and something that I think is useful. Very quickly, a couple of project examples of how well we've done in Canada on addressing climate change in EA. And so I'd say that there's been mixed experience, starting first of all, not on how well we've done, but even whether or not we've used the guidelines. I did some scouring of our registry website with the documents to see what I could find, and you don't find a lot of EA reports and projects that indicate that they clearly followed these 2003 guidelines. The one I put up, the Lower Matagami hydroelectric complex redevelopment in Ontario was one that did, and they walked very explicitly through all the steps and how they followed the guidelines, and that was interesting. But at the end of the day, the final evaluation of all that said that overall the effects are expected to be gradual and considered minimal, and so they didn't really need to take any fundamental adaptation actions. And that's probably pretty typical. Dr. Beyer is in the audience, and he's actually examined our history of how well we've treated climate change in EAs in a more comprehensive way than I did in my quick exploration. Found the Sydney tar pond example was probably fairly typical, where sometimes, quite often, you will see that a panel, the EA report, identifies there are some potential impacts, but due to relatively short, in this case, due to relatively short construction and operation period, climate change is not seen as having a significant effect. So it does illustrate, I think, some of the real challenges that we face in thinking through how good a job that we're doing on addressing the impacts and adaptation story. The flip side of the story, how well are we doing on addressing greenhouse gas emissions in EAs? I put this one up because it was particularly contentious. We got sued over it. An oil sands project where air emissions were identified as important, and there was an application for additional review to provide extra rationale supporting why the joint review panel had determined there to be no significant effects from the greenhouse gas emissions. It was an oil sands project, about 3.7 megatons of CO2 equivalent per year. There was additional rationale that was provided. It's been, it is what it is. It's been criticized, but I think the interesting story that tells is that supplementary rationale, I see the fundamental issue. It identified a long list of issues that the project was going to take to reduce its GHGs. But fundamentally, it came back to and said, the government of Alberta, the provincial government in this case, has a target for that project that it has to meet. That project says it's going to meet that target. Hence, who are we to say that there's significant impacts? Because we're going to have to go with the Alberta Environment Department's assessment of what's the significant target. That's really the question, isn't it? And that's something that we're going to have to address. Is it the role of the panel to challenge government-wide policy on what any particular target should be for reductions of GHGs? So it's an interesting one that we'll have to think our way through. Where am I for time? I got a couple more minutes? Okay, so a couple of minutes. Very quickly then, where to from here? And I want to be clear about the fact that this is something that we at the agency are just starting to think about and wrap our heads around. We haven't made any firm policy decisions on where we're going to go on improving or addressing or changing our treatment of climate change in EA. That being said, there are some obvious things that could be considered. One of them would be starting from the 2003 guidelines and improving and promoting their use. And it's something that we're certainly going to look at and think about. There are some obvious areas that could be improved. We could provide up-to-date reference for one thing and make some linkages with the community of climate change scenarios that exists out there, regional downscaling results, that sort of thing. Treatment of uncertainties and how you treat that. And again, Dr. Byer's done some excellent work on that front. Incorporation of best practices for project GHG quantification. That's something I spent the last 2 years of my life working on, so I could do that one. Guidance on assessing significance, which is a key element of our act, that we have to make a determination after mitigation, and here I'll go to that, after mitigation measures have been prescribed, will the residual environmental effects still be significant, adverse environmental effects? So we really need to figure that out, and I think it's going to beg those questions around. As I said, for any given project, I think one can argue that that single project's emissions make an essentially negligible contribution to climate change. The impacts on on the Fort McMurray area in Alberta that will come from climate change will not be affected in the least by whether that one particular oil sands project goes ahead or not, because it's a globally mixed pollutant, and it's a fundamentally different question than in a local airshed whether you release a whole bunch of NOx and VOx. That impacts on people's health, et cetera. Of course, thresholds, the NEPA CEQ guidance I thought was interesting as a starting point, not as significant, but at least as sort of a risk-based level of attention of where you start maybe drawing a line of where you ask for more analysis to be done. I've raised this question already about government targets, and having to really maybe think through that question. And is it the role of an EA to dictate government policy on how to reduce GHG emissions? And that really brings us to my third point, really trying to inspire a conversation on this question of, is EA better suited to address mitigation of GHGs or adaptation to climate impacts? You've heard a lot of people today already start to talk about the direction that I'm suggesting here, that really I think EA and the kinds of measures you can ask to be followed as a part of your project approvals might be a lot better suited towards addressing impacts and adaptation measures to climate change. But that's just my speculation. It's something we'll need to think about, especially when the overall climate change development process in a country or in a province is really probably the right place to set your targets. It was pointed out today that our Act is actually up for parliamentary review, not by the government, by a standing committee of Parliament. That's going to be starting over the next year, and it's something else we'll have to monitor and see what comes out. Some of the issues that they may consider in terms of suggesting fundamental EA reform would be things that would directly impact on our legislative responsibility for what we need to look at in the federal EA process. So it's something we'll be watching carefully. What are my messages? We are acting to combat climate change in Canada. Federal environmental assessment can and does play a role in that process. And there's been some positive steps and some progress, both on strategic EA and project EAs. But I think it's fair to say that more remains to be done. Thank you.